Play-Doh, the Give-a-Show Projector, the Easy Bake Oven, Spirograph, SSP Racers, Star Wars action figures, 300 million of them. One company made every single one. You held their toys in your hands for 30 years and you probably never knew their name. The company was called Kenner, and it is gone. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. You knew their toys before you knew the alphabet. Play-Doh was on your kitchen table when you were 3. That smell, salty, chemical, slightly sweet, completely unique, was the smell of a Tuesday afternoon in 1962 when your mother spread newspaper on the table and opened the can, and you pushed your fingers into it and made something that looked like nothing but felt like everything. You did not know it was made by a company in Cincinnati. You did not know it started as a wallpaper cleaner. You did not care. You cared about the smell and the feel and the colors and the fact that whatever you made could be smashed back into a ball and made into something else. Play-Doh was not a toy. It was a material. It was the first thing most American children ever created with their own hands, and it came from Kenner. The Give-a-Show Projector was the one you used in the dark. You loaded a film strip, a thin plastic card with 4 or 5 transparent frames on it, and you pointed the projector at the wall and the images appeared. Superman, Popeye, Huckleberry Hound, the Flintstones. You sat on your bed in your pajamas and you projected cartoons on your bedroom wall, and you were a movie theater and the audience and the projectionist all at once. The Give-a-Show Projector stayed in production for over 20 years because every child who saw one wanted one, and every child who got one used it until the bulb burned out and then begged for a new bulb. That was Kenner. The Easy Bake Oven was your sister's, or maybe it was yours and you just told people it was your sister's. A plastic oven the size of a shoebox with a 100-watt light bulb inside that actually baked actual cake from actual mix in actual tiny pans. The cake was the size of a hockey puck and tasted like a hockey puck that had been left in the sun, but it was real cake. And you made it and you ate it warm. And it was the greatest thing you had ever cooked because it was the only thing you had ever cooked. Your sister remembers the Easy Bake Oven. You remember eating what came out of it and pretending it was good because she was watching. Spirograph was the one that made you feel like an artist. The plastic gears with teeth that meshed together, the colored pens, the paper pinned to the cardboard backing. You put the pen in a hole and you traced, and the line curved and looped and crossed itself, and when you lifted the gear, you had drawn something that looked like it belonged in a museum. You did not understand the mathematics. You understood the beauty. And the beauty came from a set of plastic gears that cost $4 and was made by Kenner. The Girder and Panel sets were the ones that turned your living room floor into a city. Plastic girders, green, red, and yellow, that snapped together to make buildings, bridges, highways, and skyscrapers. You spent hours on your knees on the carpet, building a metropolis that stretched from the couch to the television, and that your father had to step over when he came home from work. The buildings were not to scale, and the bridges connected to nothing, and the highways led nowhere, but the city was yours, and it was real, and tearing it down at the end of the day was the hardest part because you knew you would have to build it again tomorrow, and it would never be exactly the same. SSP Racers were the ones that screamed. You jammed the T-shaped ripcord into the side of the car, pulled it as fast as your arm could move, and the car launched across the floor with a high-pitched whine that sounded like a jet engine had been shrunk and stuffed inside a piece of plastic. The faster you pulled, the louder the scream, and the farther the car flew. SSP stood for supersonic power, which was a lie. Nothing about a plastic car on a kitchen floor was supersonic, but it felt supersonic when you pulled that cord and the car disappeared under the dining room table at a speed that made your mother say words she usually reserved for your father. Every one of these toys came from the same place. A building on Kenner Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. A building that 3 brothers, Albert, Phillip, and Joseph Steiner, turned into a toy factory in 1947. They named the company after the street because they could not think of a better name, and it turned out they did not need one. Kenner was fine. Kenner was the sound a toy company should make: short, sharp, fun. It sounded like a kid laughing. It sounded like the noise a toy makes when it works. Their first product was a bubble-matic gun, a plastic pistol that blew soap bubbles. It was not revolutionary, but the bubble rocket that came 2 years later, a bubble-blowing rocket launcher, sold 1 million units. 1 million. In 1949, for a company run by 3 brothers on a street in Cincinnati. The Steiners learned something from that rocket that they never forgot. Children do not want things that sit still. Children want things that move, things that fly and spin and race and project and bake and scream. And for the next 50 years, that is exactly what Kenner made. But the thing Kenner is remembered for, the thing that put the company's name in the history books and in the attics and basements of 100 million households, started with a phone call that almost did not happen. In 1976, a filmmaker named George Lucas was trying to find a toy company to make figures for a movie he had not finished filming. The movie was called Star Wars. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody believed it would succeed. George Lucas went to Hasbro. Hasbro said no. He went to Mattel. Mattel said no. The 2 biggest toy companies in the world looked at a movie about space wizards and laser swords and a walking carpet named Chewbacca and said, "This is not going to sell." Kenner said yes. A company that made soap bubble guns and Play-Doh and an oven that ran on a light bulb said yes to the movie that nobody wanted. They signed the deal in April 1960. The movie opened in May, and by June, Star Wars was the highest-grossing film in the history of cinema, and every child in America wanted an action figure, and Kenner did not have a single one to sell. This is where the story gets wild, because Christmas was coming, and Kenner had no figures. The molds were not ready. The factories were not running. The plastic had not been poured. There was no Luke Skywalker. There was no Darth Vader. There was no R2-D2. There was nothing. The CEO of Kenner, a man named Bernie Loomis, made what he later called the loneliest decision of his career. He decided to sell empty boxes. The early bird certificate package was a box. Inside the box was a certificate. The certificate promised 4 action figures: Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2. That would be mailed to your house sometime in the next 2 to 6 months. The price was about $20 for a box with nothing in it, with a promise that the toys would come later, maybe. Parents bought it, thousands of them. On Christmas morning, 19, children across America opened a box and found a piece of paper, a certificate, a promise that somewhere in a factory in Cincinnati, a small plastic version of Luke Skywalker was being made just for them and would arrive in the mail in a few weeks or a few months, and that in the meantime they should hold on to this certificate and not lose it because it was the most important piece of paper they had ever owned. Some kids cried, some kids stared, some kids did not understand. But most kids, and this is the part that made Bernie Loomis right and everyone who doubted him wrong, most kids were thrilled because it was Star Wars, and Star Wars was everything that year. It was the movie, it was the lunchbox, it was the bed sheets, it was the t-shirt, it was the poster on the wall, it was the conversation at school, it was the game at recess, it was the reason you went to bed at night pretending your flashlight was a lightsaber. And a promise of Luke Skywalker, even a promise on a piece of paper in an empty box, was better than an actual anything else under that tree. The figures arrived in February and March. Small, simple 5 points of articulation, no elbow joints, no knee joints, a figure that could stand and raise its arms and turn its head, and that was it. And they were perfect. They were perfect because they were yours and they were Star Wars, and you could hold Luke Skywalker in your hand and put him in the land speeder and fly the X-Wing across the living room and stage the attack on the Death Star behind the couch and fight Darth Vader on the arm of the recliner, and the entire movie lived in your bedroom and you were the director. In the first full year of Star Wars toy production, Kenner made $100 million. $100 million from a deal that Hasbro passed on. $100 million from a deal that Mattel laughed at. $100 million from a deal that a soap bubble company from Cincinnati had the courage to take. By 1985, they had sold 300 million action figures. 300 million small plastic people in 300 million small plastic hands in 300 million bedrooms in every country that had a movie theater and a toy store. A company that started with soap bubbles on a street in Cincinnati became the most successful licensed toy manufacturer in the world because every door was closed except theirs, and they walked through it. The same year that Kenner signed the Star Wars deal, the mayor of Cincinnati, a man named Jerry Springer, The same Jerry Springer, who would later become famous for something very different, declared May 25, 1978, Star Wars Day. He gave Chewbacca a key to the city. Kenner donated toys and movie tickets to 2,800 orphans. The whole city celebrated a movie that was made in London and set in a galaxy far, far away, but that belonged, in every way that mattered, to Cincinnati. There is a detail that almost nobody knows. Before Kenner became famous, before Star Wars, before Play-Doh and Spirograph and the Easy Bake Oven, a young puppeteer in New York was hired to make television commercials for the company. His name was Jim Henson. He had not created the Muppets yet. He had not made Sesame Street. He was a man with a camera and a talent for making things come alive on screen, and Kenner hired him to bring their Goonie Bird mascot to life in TV advertisements. The man who would later give the world Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy started his career selling soap bubble guns for three brothers on Kenner Street. The company was sold in 1967. The Steiner brothers, who had built it from nothing, who had named it after their street, who had gone from bubble guns to $1 million rocket to Play-Doh to Star Wars, sold Kenner to General Mills, a cereal company. The men who made Cheerios and Wheaties now owned the men who made Spirograph and the Give-a-Show Projector. It was a good deal for the brothers. It was a death sentence for the company, but nobody knew it yet because the death took 33 years and 4 different owners to arrive. General Mills did not know how to run a toy company. They knew how to sell cereal. They knew how to market to mothers in grocery store aisles. They did not know how to walk into a room full of toy designers in Cincinnati and understand why the angle of a girder and panel connection mattered, or why the tension on an SSP ripcord had to be tested 100 times, or why Play-Doh needed to smell exactly the way it smelled, and not one chemical compound different. They were good people running a business they did not understand, and the result was predictable. In 1985, General Mills spun off Kenner alongside Parker Brothers to form Kenner Parker Toys. The cereal company was done playing with toys. 2 years later, Tonka bought Kenner Parker. The company that made steel dump trucks now owned the company that made Play-Doh and Star Wars figures. 4 years after that, Hasbro bought Tonka, and with Tonka came Kenner. And with Kenner came 300 million Star Wars figures and a legacy that stretched from Kenner Street in 1947 to a boardroom in Rhode Island in 1991. Each acquisition brought a press release about synergies and efficiencies and strategic alignment. And each acquisition brought something else: layoffs. The manufacturing moved first to Mexico, then to China. The distribution center in Cincinnati closed. The workforce shrank. The hallways got quieter. The building on Kenner Street, the building where Jim Henson had filmed commercials and where designers had sculpted the face of Luke Skywalker, and where the Steiner brothers had once packed 1 million bubble rockets into boxes by hand, that building lost people the way a tree loses leaves in October. Slowly at first, then all at once. A man who worked at Kenner for almost 15 years described it simply: every time there was a buyout, we had cutbacks. That is the story of Kenner's death in 11 words. Every time there was a buyout, we had cutbacks. The company that made 300 million Star Wars figures was cut back. The company that gave 2,800 orphans a movie and a toy was cut back. The company where Jim Henson learned to sell was cut back. Cut back and cut back and cut back until there was nothing left to cut. In the year 2000, Hasbro closed the Kenner office in Cincinnati. Not because the toys were bad, not because the designers were failing, not because the market had moved on, because a corporation in Rhode Island decided that running a toy design studio in Ohio was redundant when they already had one in Rhode Island. Efficiency. That is the word they used. Efficiency. The building emptied over weeks. 53 years of toys, from bubble guns to Star Wars to Jurassic Park, walked out the door in cardboard boxes carried by men and women who had spent their careers making children happy. The designers who had sculpted Luke Skywalker's face by hand, because in the early years every figure's face was hand-painted, and the designers chose which ones looked right and which ones did not. Those designers cleared their desks. The engineers who had figured out how to make a ripcord spin an SSP car at 10,000 RPM, those engineers turned in their badges. The people who had tested Play-Doh by smelling it, squeezing it, rolling it between their fingers to make sure the texture was right, those people said goodbye to a building that smelled like every toy they had ever made. Some moved to Hasbro's headquarters in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, some retired, some started their own design firms in Cincinnati and continued making toys for other companies, carrying the Kenner DNA inside them like a seed. All of them left knowing that the name on the building, the name that came from a street, that started with a soap bubble pistol, that peaked with the greatest licensed toy deal in the history of the American toy industry, would never appear on a new toy again. The Kenner name was briefly revived by Hasbro in 2010 as a label on a line of vintage-style Star Wars figures, a sticker on a box, a nod, a memory. But a label is not a company. A label does not have a building on a street in Cincinnati. A label does not have three brothers arguing about what to name their company and looking out the window and seeing the street sign and saying that will do. A label does not employ designers who smell Play-Doh for a living, and engineers who make plastic cars scream, and a young puppeteer named Jim Henson who shows up with a camera and a Goonie bird and an idea about what makes things come alive on a screen. You did not know any of this when you were sitting on the living room floor with Play-Doh under your fingernails and a Girder and Panel skyscraper blocking the television and an SSP car wedged under the refrigerator and a Give-a-Show projector warming up on your nightstand. You did not know the name of the company that made all of these things. You did not know they were all connected. You did not know that the Play-Doh and the Spirograph and the projector and the car and the oven that baked with a light bulb all came from the same building on the same street in the same city in Ohio. You know now. And now you know what happened to it. Three brothers built it. A cereal company bought it. A toy company bought that. A bigger toy company bought that, and then the building went dark and the street lost its name, not literally. Kenner Street is still there in Cincinnati, but the company that gave it meaning is not. And the toys that came from that building are in attics and basements and landfills and eBay listings, and the memories of every person who ever pushed their fingers into a can of Play-Doh and smelled that smell. That smell. You remember it right now. Salty, chemical, slightly sweet, completely unique. You are sitting wherever you are sitting, reading these words, and you can smell it. That is what Kenner left behind. Not a building, not a brand, not a stock price, a smell. The smell of a Tuesday afternoon when you were 3 years old and the newspaper was on the table and the can was open and the world was made of something you could shape with your hands. That was Kenner, and it is gone. But the smell is still in your head, and nobody can close that down.